Rain still clung to the stone when Staff Sergeant Trey Garcia crossed the plaza in measured cadence, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm beneath the slate dawn. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while mist drifted low through the rows of white headstones and a waiting crowd stood hushed, as if standing inside a chapel built from marble, memory, and names carved for eternity. The rain had passed only minutes earlier, leaving the flagstones near Arlington's Memorial Amphitheater transit gate dark and gleaming like polished onyx under the first diluted light of morning. Water beaded on railings, on rope posts, on the brass corners of ceremonial stands, and each droplet caught the weak sun in brief flashes that looked almost like signal lights. Above the slope, the cemetery rose in disciplined geometry, white markers in exact lines, each one small from a distance, yet vast with meaning as the mist moved among them. No one in that gathering had to be told to lower their voice. The place itself required it. The place taught it. Trey moved through that silence as though he had been forged for it. 6'2", shoulders square beneath an immaculate dress uniform, he seemed less like a man crossing stone and more like a standard held upright against weather and time. His kepi sat at the precise angle, brim level, chin fixed. White gloves remained pristine despite the wet morning. Brass buttons held a hard, steady gleam. Every crease in his jacket and trousers stood so sharply defined they looked engineered rather than pressed, lines cut with the same exactness that shaped military ritual into a language of respect. The Tomb Guard badge on his chest caught one pale ray and flashed once like steel. Families formed a quiet half-circle behind the rope line, their breath visible in the cold. A father in a worn field jacket adjusted his young son's collar and then removed his own cap without prompting. 2 high school boys, who had arrived filming each other, lowered their phones to chest level and then, after one glance at Trey's march, switched the screens off entirely. An elderly couple stood shoulder to shoulder near the front, both wearing old veteran pins. The woman's hand rested lightly on her husband's forearm, not for balance, but for steadiness of feeling. A teacher with a laminated school badge held a finger to her lips, and 30 students obeyed at once, their chatter collapsing into reverent stillness. Near the center rail stood a retired Marine with campaign ribbons on his overcoat and a cane in his right hand. His posture had the stiff dignity of a man who had paid for every inch of spine he still carried. He watched Trey's steps with the concentration of someone reading scripture he already knew by heart. Not far from him, a nurse in navy scrubs pushed a wheelchair with careful control over the damp stone. The girl in the chair, Emma Pike, 9 years old, sat wrapped in a rain shell the color of deep green pine, her dark hair pinned back, her eyes fixed on Trey with unblinking intensity. She did not fidget. She did not whisper. She watched each turn as if she were counting with him. Trey felt all of it without looking directly at any of it. To the crowd he appeared carved from discipline, expression set, gaze controlled, movements ritualized into near-mechanical precision. Inside, his awareness worked at a different velocity, cataloging placement, spacing, posture, wind direction, hands, bags, attention lines, and the shifting edges of the group around the transit gate. His instincts were on high alert, not from fear, but from responsibility. Ceremonial duty did not reduce readiness, it refined it. The same body that held stillness could break into action in a heartbeat if sacred order demanded it. At the 21st step, he halted with exact finality, the stop so clean that several in the crowd unconsciously held their breath with him. He paused, he turned. The movement was not dramatic, yet it carried the force of something older than any person watching, older than any camera in any pocket, older even than the buildings that framed the hill. In that small, precise pivot lived a vow. Memory would not be neglected on his watch. Sacrifice would not be treated as decorative background noise. He resumed the return walk, boot heels striking stone with crisp, metronomic authority that traveled through wet air like a heartbeat heard across a room. By the first week of November, dawn ceremonies had taken on that particular cold that stiffened fingers and clarified thought. Wind moved down from the rise and pushed at uniforms and coats, making flags above the gate stand taut for a second and then settle. The smell in the air carried rainwater, old leaves, machine oil from service vehicles staged beyond view, and the faint metallic edge of polished railings. Somewhere farther down the road, a bus exhaled its brakes and went quiet. Up here, near the marble and the rope line, the world narrowed to cadence, stone, and witness. A young boy in the school group leaned toward his teacher and whispered, "Does he ever miss?" The teacher shook her head gently before answering under her breath. "Not when it matters." The boy nodded and folded his hands against his chest. 2 steps behind him, a girl with a notebook tucked under her arm traced the 21 count with her thumb against the notebook spine, lips moving silently. A middle-aged man wearing a contractor's jacket and work boots removed his gloves and held them in both hands, eyes lowered, then raised them again to Trey with a respect he might not have had words to explain. The crowd learned in real time what this place required. At the edge of the transit lane, ceremonial equipment waited under a temporary canopy, the draped stand, polished transfer rails, and a wheeled case that held wreath components for a later movement detail. A military sedan sat farther back, windshield still dotted with rain. An airport liaison in a dark coat checked a clipboard, then looked up and simply watched Trey's cadence instead of interrupting. Every person in that perimeter understood that timing mattered and that sequence mattered, but none of them would break the ritual to ask questions that could wait. Protocol here was not bureaucracy. It was respect in visible form. Trey reached his next pause point, halted, and turned again. A scar along his left forearm, hidden beneath cloth, pulled faintly with each crisp angle of movement, an old reminder from shrapnel that had arrived years earlier in a place where rain smelled like dust and cordite instead of leaves and granite. He never spoke of it in public and did not need to. The scar had already taught him what permanence felt like. So had names. So had silence after radio traffic went dead. He held those lessons behind a face unreadable to strangers and entirely legible to anyone who had worn a uniform long enough to lose someone. What no one in the school group could have guessed from the flawless cadence was that Trey had trained himself to let grief travel through structure rather than speech. He had learned that discipline could carry weight that words could not. Every measured step gave shape to memory. Every turn made room for the absent. He did not perform solemnity for tourists. He inhabited it because he had seen what happened when remembrance became casual and sacrifice became a footnote. This ground refused that forgetting, and so did he. Emma Pike shifted in her wheelchair and tugged once at the nurse's sleeve. "How many now?" she whispered. The nurse leaned down, eyes still on Trey. "Enough to make it count," she replied, then touched Emma's shoulder with careful tenderness. Emma nodded, lips pressed tight in concentration, and lifted her chin a little higher. Her gaze followed Trey the way a compass needle follows true north. The retired Marine with the cane noticed her and gave a small, approving nod without speaking, one witness recognizing another. A gust swept across the plaza and carried a scatter of yellow leaves over the wet stone. One leaf landed near Trey's path, and stuck flat against the marble, bright as a metal against gray. He marched past without breaking cadence, and the leaf trembled in the wake of his step before settling again. The visual contrast, the temporary and the permanent, the drifting and the disciplined, hung in the air with quiet force. People who had arrived expecting a ceremony discovered they were standing inside a living argument about values, what fades, what endures, and who chooses to carry the burden of endurance when no applause is guaranteed. At the rail, one of the high school students who had pocketed his phone whispered to his friend, "I thought this was just a guard detail." His friend answered, barely audible, "Not just." Neither of them looked away after that. A grandmother in a wool hat pressed a folded photo against her chest and closed her eyes for 3 beats of Trey's cadence, then opened them with tears she did not wipe away. An airport shuttle driver paused during a route handoff, removed his cap, and stood still in the wind, posture straightening by instinct as the march continued. Trey's internal clock marked distances and intervals with practiced precision. He registered the placement of the wheelchair, the cane, the school cluster, the wet patches on stone, the line of sight from the outer walkway, and the choke point where the rope line narrowed near the gate post. Externally, he remained motionless at each halt, then fluid through each turn, his face an unreadable mask of discipline. Internally, he held readiness coiled, not aggressive, not anxious, simply prepared in the way professionals are prepared when duty includes protecting people who did not come expecting to need protection. The sky lightened by one shade, enough to turn the mist silver. Bells from a distant chapel carried softly across the grounds and dissolved into wind. Trey completed another sequence. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. No flourish, no wasted motion, no appeal for recognition. The crowd watched, learning that honor in this place was not loud, and that strength sometimes looked like stillness held under weight. Around him, the morning settled into a solemn rhythm that felt less like performance than promise, and for one more suspended stretch of dawn, the sacred order held. Then the sacred order broke. A blur in charcoal gray came over the rope line from the outer walkway, shoes slapping wet stone, hood up despite the wind, grin wide and hungry for witness. The young man cleared the post with one planted hand, landed hard, and surged straight down Trey Garcia's lane with his right arm extended. In that hand sat a compact black pistol shape, matte slide, squared profile, muzzle leveled chest high as he shouted across the plaza, "Move, parade boy!" The words cracked through the mist like a snapped cable. The crowd froze. A teacher's hand tightened on a student's shoulder. The retired Marine's cane skidded half an inch on rain-slick marble. Emma Pike's nurse locked both hands on the wheelchair grips and stopped breathing. What no one in that half-circle understood in that first suspended second was that the sentinel in white gloves was not ornamental steel. He was a veteran of 3 deployments, trained to read the geometry of violence faster than panic could travel through civilian eyes. Milo Trent looked exactly like the kind of man who mistook attention for authority. Designer hoodie, expensive watch, camera clipped to his chest harness, hair cut with the practiced disorder of someone who paid to look spontaneous. He came forward on the balls of his feet with performative swagger and no reverence in him at all. His left hand flicked once toward the crowd as if inviting them to register his entrance, then snapped back for balance as he accelerated. The fake pistol had been altered for realism, the orange tip painted over with black enamel, and the drizzle on its barrel gave it a lethal sheen under the gray morning light. 2 teenagers near the rope line recognized him a heartbeat, too late from a stream they had watched the week before, One inhaled sharply and whispered his name. The other went pale and said nothing. Milo saw only a uniform and a camera angle. He did not see the wet footing variables Trey had already mapped. He did not see the school children bunched left of center, or the narrow gap between Emma's wheelchair and the rail, or the cane now tipped at a dangerous angle beside the Marine's right boot. He saw a target for content. Trey's face did not change. To the crowd, he was still a carved figure at the end of a ceremonial line, jaw set, eyes fixed, shoulders squared against the wind. Inside him, calculations ignited with combat-honed speed. Distance, closing fast. Dominant hand, right. Grip tension, unstable, thumb high, index tight in adrenaline clamp. Stride length, overcommitted. Center of gravity, forward and vulnerable on wet stone. Civilian density. Heavy rear arc. Child and mobility device in immediate hazard corridor. Apparent weapon status. Credible until controlled. He had run this analysis in other countries under harsher skies, with mortar smoke in his throat and radio chatter clipped by static, but this morning the stakes carried a different weight. These were not men in armor around him. These were families, students, a nurse, an old Marine, a child with her father's eyes. The wind lifted the edge of Milo's hood and threw a strip of rainwater across his cheek. He grinned wider, feeding on the terror he believed he had manufactured, and shouted again, louder, "Move!" His shoes hit the polished patch where runoff still filmed, the stone near Trey's turn point. The sole slipped and caught, just enough to distort his line. That tiny hitch in gait would have gone unseen by nearly everyone present. Trey saw it instantly. The body under the dress coat remained composed, but every muscle along his back and legs coiled with controlled force, not fury, not spectacle, just readiness distilled into function. A high school student near the rail dropped his folded program. A mother pulled her son behind her coat without taking her eyes off the barrel. Somewhere behind the crowd, an airport liaison reached for his radio and fumbled it once. Emma spoke in a thin, stunned whisper. "Nurse?" "I've got you," the nurse said, voice tight, and angled the wheelchair 6 inches toward the rail, trying to shrink her profile without rolling into another family. The retired Marine planted his cane again, jaw flexing. "Stay down," he murmured to no one in particular, old reflex returning before thought. Milo was now inside 10 feet. The fake muzzle held steady by luck more than skill, and his chest-mounted camera blinked red, streaming his sprint to a faceless audience waiting for a spike in views. Trey tracked the blinking light for 1 fraction of a second, understood exactly what it meant, and gave it no weight at all. The crowd measured life in fear and confusion in that instant. Trey measured it in angles, leverage, and timing windows narrower than a breath. He had seen men bluff with empty rifles and men kill with shaking hands. He had seen hesitation cost blood. He had also learned that discipline was the line between lawful force and chaos. And the plaza was silent now, except for Milo's footfalls and the dry click of Trey's final heel adjustment on marble. A schoolgirl clutched her notebook to her chest so hard the spiral edge marked her palm. The elderly woman with the veteran pin closed her eyes and whispered a prayer under her breath. The 2 boys who had pocketed their phones stood rooted, stunned by the speed at which spectacle had turned to threat. Even the flag seemed to pause between gusts. Milo raised the weapon shape another inch, almost level with Trey's sternum, and took 1 more stride into the line. Trey's left shoulder shifted by a degree so slight, only another trained eye would have named it movement. He had not broken control. He had not surrendered composure. He was exactly where duty required him to be, about to decide in less than a second whether this morning would stay ceremonial or become emergency. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. 30 minutes earlier, the same stone had held only rain, wind, and preparation. Trey had stepped out from the service corridor near Memorial Amphitheater Transit Gate just after 0640, carrying the solemnity of tomb duty into a mission that sat outside the plaza yet belonged to the same moral map. The assignment order had come down before dawn: public wreath transfer detail, secure movement corridor, then coordinated handoff to a transport team bound for Reagan National, where a Gold Star Youth Remembrance Program would begin by mid-morning. To civilians, it looked procedural, another uniformed presence near a gate. To Trey, it was a continuity of vow. Names did not lose significance when they crossed a curb line. The rain had eased to mist by then, and ground crew members were toweling down transfer rails under a portable canopy. A staff specialist from ceremonial operations checked crate seals and read serial numbers aloud, while an airport liaison confirmed route windows over encrypted radio. "Transit lane opens at 0730, the liaison had said, glancing at his watch. 2 civilian buses staggered before closure. Police support on call." "Copy," Trey answered, voice level. One word, clear, final. Colonel James Whitaker stood near the sedan with his coat collar up against the cold, reviewing a slim folder under a clip light. He was broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, ribbons aligned in exact rows, a man who had spent decades distinguishing between pageantry and purpose and had no patience for confusing the two. He looked up as Trey approached, scanned his uniform once, and gave a brief nod that carried trust rather than ceremony. "Staff Sergeant Garcia, you have point on the public side until transfer wheels are loaded. School group rerouted through this gate due to road work. Keep the corridor orderly, keep it dignified." "Yes, sir." Whitaker closed the folder. "Gold Star youth are already at the airport annex. Some of those kids are carrying their parents' medals in their pockets. We do this right." Trey held his gaze. "We will, sir." By 0652, the first visitors had begun collecting along the rope line because the rain break gave tour guides a narrow weather window. A teacher led students in 2 files, shoes squeaking on damp stone, eyes wide at the sight of uniforms and marble under low clouds. The retired Marine arrived alone, cane in one hand, folded umbrella in the other, and asked no favors. He merely took his place and removed his cap. A contractor on his way to a maintenance shift paused outside the rail, then stayed. The nurse brought Emma Pike through the gate at a careful pace. Paperwork clipped to the back of the chair and stopped where sightlines were clear. Trey recognized the surname on the authorization list when he had first reviewed morning access notes, and the recognition had landed in him like controlled detonation. Pike, Emma Pike. Dependent attendee, medical support escort, Gold Star youth linkage verified. He had kept his expression unchanged because discipline demanded it, but memory had risen with sharp edges all the same. Specialist Nolan Pike laughing in a chow tent, with powdered eggs on his tray. Nolan wiping dust from his helmet and saying, "If I ever make a scene, brother, make it a good one." Nolan gone on a road where the sun was white and merciless, and the radio went from crowded to silent in one shredded second. Trey had not spoken that memory aloud in years. He did not need to. It informed every step he took. At 0701, while mist drifted through the headstones above, Trey conducted his lane assessment again. Rope tension, secure. Post bases, stable. Slip zones identified near runoff seams. Visitor density, moderate and increasing. Secondary exit corridor clear behind canopy. He caught the eye of a young specialist assigned to equipment watch and gave 2 concise hand signals. Hold position, monitor crowd edge. The specialist nodded and adjusted stance. No theatrics, just professionals setting a perimeter around remembrance. Emma had asked the nurse a quiet question, then looking toward Trey. Is he from the tomb? The nurse lowered herself to Emma's level. Yes. Does he know my dad's name? A pause. Wind touched the nurse's hair at the temple. People there remember all of them, honey? Emma absorbed that answer with a solemnity rare in any child, then folded her small hands in her lap and faced the lane. Trey did not turn toward her. Protocol held. Yet his awareness marked her position and never released it. By 0708, 2 teenagers in brand-name jackets hovered beyond the main group, whispering over a phone screen, glancing up, glancing down, thumbs moving quickly. One of them laughed once, nervously, and pointed toward the gate approach road. Trey registered the gesture as background activity, neither immediate threat nor irrelevant noise, and stored it. A man in a charcoal hoodie moved at the far perimeter, partially obscured by a service van, head angled toward the plaza with the kinetic impatience of someone waiting for a cue. Trey's attention touched him, filed him, returned to cadence. The distance was still wide, the behavior still ambiguous, and duty did not grant permission for conjecture without trigger. 3 days of drizzle had left the stone deceptive underfoot. Traction shifted by inches. Reflections masked depth. Trey adjusted his turn points accordingly, calibrating stride to preserve exact rhythm without sacrificing stability. To bystanders, he appeared untouched by weather. To trained observers, he was adapting continuously inside the ritual, preserving form and function as one discipline. At 0710, Whitaker received a call, listened 10 seconds, and moved aside to answer. His tone was clipped. Understood. Keep airport police stage but out of frame unless requested. He ended the call, looked once toward Trey's lane, and tucked the phone away. The colonel trusted his sentinel to manage the public boundary until an explicit trigger demanded broader intervention. That trust was not sentiment. It was earned through standards measured over years. The wind freshened. Flags snapped taut. The school group settled into silence. The Marine braced on his cane. Emma watched without blinking. Trey reached his halt point, paused, turned, and resumed his 21 steps through mist and reflected light, carrying private grief inside public precision, while the morning gathered witnesses from every corner of ordinary life. And then at 7:12, the man in the charcoal hoodie cleared the rope line and ran. He ran, and the plaza seemed to narrow around him. Rainwater still glazed the transit lane in thin sheets that mirrored boots, wheels, and the low iron sky. And for one stretched instant, every witness stood inside the same cold silence, held there by disbelief more than fear. The white headstones above the gate rose through drifting mist like ranks of silent sentinels called to attention. A flag cracked once in the wind and then snapped straight. Red and white pulled hard against gray. The smell of wet granite, brass polish, and diesel from idling service vehicles sat in the air, sharp and metallic, while Milo Trent's shoes slapped toward sacred ground with reckless speed, and the chest camera on his harness blinked a hard red pulse that looked obscene against the morning's solemn palette. Trey Garcia did not flinch. At 6'2", he filled his lane with a stillness that carried more force than shouting ever could. His shoulders squared under a uniform immaculate down to the seam lines, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, buttons aligned and gleaming, white gloves pristine despite the damp, kepi set with exact geometry. Tomb Guard badge bright on his chest like a small shield forged from duty itself. His face remained an unreadable mask of discipline. His eyes, locked on a point only he could see, gave no hint of the threat map already forming behind them. To most of the people watching, he was ceremony. To the few who had worn a uniform long enough to lose friends, he was what ceremony is built to contain: vigilance, restraint, and a willingness to move only when movement meant protection. The people nearest the rope line made the scene feel painfully human in its detail. The retired Marine shifted his cane and planted his boots wider, campaign ribbons trembling faintly on his overcoat as the wind lifted the cloth. Two high school boys who had laughed about something trivial a minute earlier now stood with their hands open and empty, phones forgotten in their pockets, mouths slightly parted, as if they had been ordered silent by something larger than authority. The teacher held one arm out across 3 students at once, palm flat, not dramatic, simply instinctive. A father pulled his son behind his jacket and then, seeing Emma's chair, moved half a step aside to clear space. The nurse in navy scrubs angled the wheelchair toward the rail with careful pressure, one hand on the grip, one on Emma's shoulder, shielding without jarring. Emma Pike sat very still, rain shells zipped to her chin, eyes fixed on Trey with an intensity that belonged to someone older than 9. From the canopy edge, the airport liaison finally got his radio to his mouth. "Possible weapon breach at Memorial Gate," he said, voice strained but controlled. "Repeat, possible weapon breach, active approach inside rope." The specialist by the equipment case heard him, tightened his jaw, and held the hand signal Trey had given earlier. "Maintain position, preserve corridor, do not stampede civilians into the lane." Colonel Whitaker, 10 yards off near the sedan, turned at once toward the shout and started forward. Folder dropped to his side, expression hardening into command. He had seen enough uniforms under pressure to know the difference between panic and procedure, and what he saw now was procedure under direct threat. Milo kept coming. Wet hoodie dark against marble, grin still fixed, right arm extended with the altered fake pistol-pointed center mass. His arrogance had one visual tell that gave him away more than the weapon did. He kept flicking his eyes to where he imagined the best camera angle would be, checking audience before consequence, performance before reality. One of the teenagers at the back recognized that look and whispered, voice cracking, "He does this online." No one answered. A grandmother in a wool hat pressed a folded photograph to her chest and bowed her head. The contractor in the work boots removed his cap and held it against his sternum. Eyes narrowed not in confusion, but in dawning outrage. They had come to witness respect. They were now witnessing its violation. Time did what it always did in real emergencies. It expanded unevenly. Every drop of water running along the curb became visible. Every breath sounded louder. Trey registered distance in fractions, angle in degrees, crowd density in vectors. He tracked the fake weapon's muzzle drift, the tension in Milo's forearm, the slight hitch in his stride from the slick patch near the turn point, the blind spot created by the wheelchair's right wheel, the cane's position by the Marine's boot. The school group clustered left of center. The calculus was not heroic in his mind. It was technical, immediate, and bound by rules he had sworn to uphold. Apparent lethal threat plus dense civilians equaled one duty: end the hazard fast, end it lawfully, keep bystanders upright, keep sacred ground from becoming a crime scene. Inside that dilation, memory rose and vanished in sharp fragments. Helmand roads that went quiet a beat too soon, Raqqa concrete under indirect fire, and the dead weight of another man's vest in his grip, the old shrapnel scar on his left forearm tightening in cold rain. Nolan Pike's laugh cut short by a blast and the vow that followed. Then the present snapped back, bright and exact. Milo's shoe hit the wet seam and skated half an inch. The fake muzzle bobbed high, then corrected down toward Trey's sternum. Trey marked the correction as information. Right hand dominant, wrist rigid, elbow locked, shoulder overcommitted. That posture made the weapon line fast but brittle. If Trey took the arm at the elbow seam and rotated through the shoulder plane, he could break aim without firing line sweep toward the rope. If he stepped too deep, Milo's momentum could carry both of them into the civilians. If he waited too long, the apparent weapon stayed centered on him, long enough to force a deadlier response from anyone arriving with less context. Every option carried cost. One carried the lowest risk to everyone else. "Stay behind me," the teacher whispered, not turning her head, keeping contact with each student by fingertips and sleeve grips so none of them bolted. The retired Marine's jaw flexed. His voice came out rough and immediate, old command reflex kicking in before caution could restrain it. "Weapon! Down!" The word cracked through the lane and made two people in the back flinch hard enough to stumble into each other. The nurse locked Emma's chair brakes with a sharp metallic click, pivoted the frame another 6 inches so the armrest shielded Emma's torso, and lowered her own center of gravity beside the chair as if bracing for impact. Emma's hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles pale. Without taking her eyes off Trey, she asked, barely above a breath, "Is he going to hurt him?" The nurse kept one palm steady on Emma's shoulder. "No," she said, voice low and firm. "Stay with me. Eyes on me for 1 second." Emma obeyed, then looked back anyway, frightened but focused, as if refusing to surrender the moment to panic. Rain tapped the edge of her footrest and dripped from the nurse's sleeve in a steady rhythm that felt impossibly calm against the violence rushing toward them. From the right flank, Whitaker closed another step and let command cut through his chest. "Hold positions," he barked, one hand signaling down and out to prevent a crowd surge. "Do not enter the lane." He angled his body to block two well-meaning civilians who had started forward, then redirected them back with a forearm and a hard stare that left no room for argument. His other hand came up toward his own radio, but stopped when he saw Trey's line and timing. Interference now would add variables, not control them. The specialist by the cases mirrored the order to nearby staff with clipped gestures, preserving the transfer corridor exactly as planned, even while the plan itself twisted under threat. "Possible weapon still up," the airport liaison transmitted, breath audibly faster now. "Subject in charcoal hoodie, chest camera, moving on ceremonial guard. Units expedite." A burst of static answered, then a distant acknowledgement. He shifted his stance under the canopy pillar for a clearer channel, and repeated location markers with procedural precision, each word forcing structure onto a scene trying to collapse into chaos. Behind him, two transport officers at the perimeter took involuntary half-steps before checking themselves, eyes on Whitaker, waiting for the command that had not yet come. Milo shouted something that sounded like theater, trying to mimic danger, words pitched for a live-stream crowd instead of the living people in front of him. "Don't move! Don't move!" he yelled, and the contradiction of it, commanding stillness while sprinting into sacred protocol with a painted-over fake gun, jarred even those who did not yet understand who he was. The red light on his chest mount kept blinking. He turned his chin a fraction toward that camera, hungry for reaction, and in that fraction, Trey saw the seam again. Performance over control, attention over balance, ego over survival. Trey's right boot settled with microscopic precision on marble, slick as glass, heel lightly grounded, forefoot alive for drive. His left foot adjusted 4 inches, opening his hips without telegraphing intent. His hands stayed at a ceremonial neutral that looked passive to untrained eyes and ready to anyone who understood leverage. He measured the interval to contact as 2 strides, then 1.5, then 1. At this range, no shouted warning would buy time. Sound lagged behind motion. His breath stayed even. Diaphragm quiet, heart rate elevated but contained. Years of drilled control converting adrenaline into clean mechanics. The fake pistol crossed an invisible threshold. Inside the distance where a stumble, a grab, or a panic shot from elsewhere could kill bystanders. Trey committed. His lead shoulder dipped a degree. His center line shifted off the muzzle path. His left hand came up not to strike first, but to redirect, palm angled for the weapon-bearing forearm, while his right side loaded for body control. The move was compact, almost ungainly to spectators expecting cinematic violence, and that was its purpose: small geometry, high effect, minimal splash. He was not trying to win a fight. He was trying to end a hazard in a crowded memorial lane with children, elders, and a wheelchair within arm's reach. The Marine sucked in a breath through his teeth, as if he could brace the whole scene by force of will alone. The teacher tightened her arm barrier. The father's hand clamped his son's shoulder so hard the boy winced and did not pull away. Whitaker's command voice dropped from bark to blade. "Stand fast." The liaison kept talking into the radio, now almost whispering coordinates so he would not drown out the contact moment. The wind pushed mist across the lane in a thin sheet, and droplets flashed against Milo's sleeve like sparks. For a blink, sacred order and public disorder occupied the same square yard of wet stone. Then Trey moved through that seam with the same disciplined intent he had brought to every 21-step turn since dawn. No wasted motion, no theatrics, only controlled duty under pressure. He was fully visible at last. Milo Trent was 26, lean and gym-cut, chest camera blinking through rain beads, expression split between aggression and performance. Even in motion, he kept trying to square his torso to the lens, a reflex more practiced than caution. Trey did not need a biography to read the threat. The crowd had already named him, the radio had already carried the warning, and Milo's behavior confirmed the profile in real time. Monetized, prank escalation, staged bravado, altered fake pistol held like a prop until the prop crossed into a live civilian corridor. He sprinted with center mass presentation and bad footing discipline, shoes skimming water on polished marble. His confidence came from a fatal assumption that had served him elsewhere, that ceremonial discipline meant physical passivity, that a guard in dress uniform would prioritize optics over protection, and that any response could be edited to cast him as victim. He had read policy headlines, not people. He saw white gloves and polished brass, and imagined a decorative employee whose power ended at a rope line. He did not understand that beneath that immaculate coat stood a combat veteran with lawful force training, threat recognition sharpened under fire, and zero appetite for spectacle. "Stop right there!" Whitaker's command struck across the lane like a hammer blow, but Milo's focus stayed glued to his blinking camera light. He angled his chest for framing, trying to keep both his grin and the weapon profile visible to viewers. That one vanity turn opened his right shoulder seam. Trey marked it. Near the canopy pillar, the airport liaison received dispatch in a burst of static and clipped words. "Units 2 minutes out. Maintain visual. Do not close unless immediate neutralization." He answered without taking his eyes off the lane. Visual maintained. Guard engaging control now. His voice shook once, then steadied. Beside him, one of the teenagers who had recognized Milo finally found his breath and blurted, It's fake, I think. But he painted it. He painted the tip black. The liaison snapped his gaze to the boy for half a beat, then transmitted the update exactly. Possible imitation firearm altered for realism. Repeat, altered imitation firearm. That detail rippled through the adults nearest the rope line and tightened every face. Outrage replaced confusion with startling speed, as if the social contract had been torn in front of them, and everyone saw the same tear at once. The retired Marine's mouth hardened into a straight line, as if carved there. "For views," he said under his breath, the words carrying a bitterness old soldiers recognized instantly. The teacher kept her arm barrier across her students and answered without looking away, "Eyes down! Hands to your sides!" They obeyed, trembling but disciplined. One girl whispered, "Why would anyone do this here?" No one offered her an answer that would make sense. Emma remained behind the angled armrest, sheltered by the nurse's body and the rail, her gaze fixed on Trey's profile. The nurse kept one hand braced on the wheelchair frame and one at Emma's shoulder blade, physical reassurance without obstructing her airway or line of sight. Rain tapped softly on the chair's metal rim. Emma could not know wrist-lock mechanics or force continuum language, but she knew composure when she saw it, and what she saw in that instant was not panic. It was certainty. Inside Trey, the world reduced to vectors and responsibility. He tracked muzzle orientation, wrist rigidity, elbow lock, hip momentum, surface friction, civilian arcs, and the narrow legal threshold between apparent lethal threat and controlled intervention. His breathing stayed even, a measured draw and release trained through years when noise, smoke, and fear had tried to fracture judgment. He felt the old scar under his sleeve pull with the torque of his shoulder, a brief sting that carried a single image with it. Nolan Pike grinning through dust and saying, "Gentlemen, behold tactical gravity." Then the image was gone, and the lane was all that remained. External composure held. Internal readiness peaked. Every muscle from Trey's calves through his back coiled in sequence, not with rage, with precision. He was aware of Whitaker's position, closing from the right, the Marine's cane tip left rear, the nurse's lowered stance, Emma's locked brakes, the student's tight cluster, the slick seam under Milo's lead foot, and the open wedge of space he could use to redirect the muzzle away from civilians. There was no empty space in his attention, nothing blurred, nothing rushed. Time stretched wide enough for full accountability. "Garcia, corridor is yours," Whitaker said, voice lower now, a commander's trust compressed into 4 words. "Yes, sir," Trey answered, equally low, and moved another inch off the muzzle path. Milo heard the exchange and misread it. He thought the title was theater. He thought corridor meant pageant choreography. His grin sharpened into contempt. "Look at you," he spat, breath ragged from the sprint. "Toy soldier, with permission slips." The insult hung in the rain and died there, powerless against the discipline facing him. Trey did not answer. Silence was not surrender. It was control. The camera on Milo's chest kept streaming. Thousands watched from couches and buses and office break rooms, seeing a uniform and a weapon shape and a man in a hoodie performing bravado. They could not feel the cold, could not smell rain on marble, could not hear the small sounds that mattered most. The metallic click of wheelchair brakes, the whisper of school jackets as children held still, the cane ferrule, scraping for better purchase, the tiny reset of polished leather as Trey set his pivot foot for maximum traction. They could not see what trained eyes saw in Milo's hand. Index pressure, too eager, thumb placement high, wrist line brittle, elbow overextended, a grip built for show, not for control. "Sir, please stop," one of the students whispered. Not to Trey, not to Whitaker, but toward Milo himself, as if appeal could pierce ego. Milo never looked at her. His attention stayed on his own lens. Trey's duty did not. He mapped the final sequence with clinical clarity. First, displace muzzle up and off crowd plane. Second, isolate weapon wrist against forearm and deny recoil path, real or perceived. Third, rotate shoulder through its weak axis while stepping outside Milo's forward line. Fourth, guide momentum down to stone with torso control, keeping the head clear and the weapon hand pinned. Fifth, verbal command and scene freeze until law enforcement arrival. No flourish, no strike unless resistance escalated. Protect civilians, preserve evidence, retain command presence. Textbook, if execution held under rain and speed. Rain ticked from the brim of his kepi in slow intervals. His white glove brushed black enamel for the first time, and felt tack where paint had pooled near the muzzle seam. Confirmation. Altered imitation, freshly coated. Distinctive detail recorded without thought. It would matter later in reports, in charges, in sworn statements where performance finally met consequence. Milo closed another step, heel skidding, then catching. The fake pistol stayed center mass for a fraction too long, and that fraction was enough. Trey shifted his lead foot a final half-width, setting hip line to absorb and redirect. Whitaker's shoulders squared as he cut inward from the right, but held his distance, preserving Trey's lane and keeping secondary interference out of the takedown geometry. The liaison lifted his radio higher, eyes wide and unblinking. The teacher tightened her arm across two students, trying to flinch upward. The retired Marine drew one breath through his nose and locked his knees despite the cane tremor. The nurse angled Emma 2 degrees farther behind her own body. "Units now 90 seconds, dispatch crackled through the liaison's radio. 90 seconds is too long for a live line, Whitaker replied. Not into the radio, just to the truth of the moment. Trey agreed and committed fully. He sank weight through his lead leg and entered with compact force, shoulder turned, hips aligned, eyes unreadable. To the crowd, he still looked almost calm, as if ceremony itself had leaned forward by 1 degree. Inside, every instinct fired in disciplined order. There was no anger to cloud motion, only an old vow translated into muscle memory. No one would bring panic to this ground and call it entertainment. Milo's painted weapon jerked upward as Trey's left hand trapped the wrist seam. Trey's right forearm crossed the elbow line and closed the lever before Milo could retract. The chest camera bobbled hard, horizon tilting as Milo tried to wrench free for the shot. Trey stepped outside the attack line and rotated through the shoulder's weak plane. Milo's next footfall landed on standing water and lost its edge. His center folded forward into Trey's control arc. The grin vanished, replaced by sudden, naked alarm. "Weapon hand secured!" Whitaker shouted, loud enough for crowd and camera both, command voice cutting panic before it spread. Gasps erupted a half-second late, rolling through veterans, students, families, and staff like a single breath finally released. The lane that had seemed frozen broke into sound, then locked again under Whitaker's barked command to hold position. The nurse kept Emma sheltered. The Marine stayed planted. The teacher held her line. The liaison kept transmitting. The teenagers stared at the painted muzzle, now pointed safely into open air, their earlier uncertainty resolved in one undeniable image. Milo thrashed once, more reflex than technique, trying to torque his wrist back toward frame. Trey converted the motion into downward momentum, tight and efficient, guiding rather than slamming, knee to stone, shoulder down, wrist pinned, muzzle still offline. The camera scraped wet marble and sent a jittering view of gray sky, white gloves, and the edge of Trey's coat as control closed around the stuntman's last angle. "Do not move," Trey said, low and precise, pressure calibrated at the edge of compliance. "Hands open. Now." For the first time since breaching the rope, Milo obeyed something other than his audience. His fingers spread. The fake pistol loosened under controlled pressure, paint streaking faintly onto Trey's glove. Whitaker stepped in to secure perimeter without crowd breach, one hand out toward civilians, one eye on Trey's hold. The liaison relayed position and status in clipped cadence. Suspect grounded, apparent imitation weapon controlled, no civilian injury observed. Sirens, still distant, threaded through the rain. Emma watched without blinking. The nurse's hand remained steady at her shoulder. The retired Marine exhaled and reset his cane tip, jaw tight but posture easing by degrees. The teacher finally let one student duck behind her hip while keeping the group compact. No one crossed the line. No one rushed the scene. Sacred order, ruptured seconds earlier, began to reassemble around disciplined force and clear command. Trey felt Milo's momentum, crossed the point of no recovery, and guided it down, measured and absolute, toward the wet stone where bravado ended and accountability began. Trey completed the descent with exact control, turning Milo's collapsing momentum into a clean stop instead of a violent spill, one knee anchored beside the shoulder line, one white-gloved hand pinning the wrist, the other stripping the weapon free in a single, efficient peel. The fake pistol clattered once, slid through a shallow film of rainwater, and came to rest against the edge of the lane with its black-painted muzzle tilted toward the sky. In that small sound, polymer on stone, cheap and hollow, the performance died. Milo's breath came fast and ragged against the marble. He twisted, testing the hold, then froze when Trey adjusted pressure by a fraction and removed every angle of escape without escalating force. The chest camera on Milo's harness kept blinking red, now aimed at wet ground and polished boots, and the rigid white line of Trey's glove across his forearm. Trey's voice came low, steady, and absolute, carrying across the lane with the force of a command learned where hesitation cost lives. "On sacred ground, we do not rehearse death." The sentence struck the crowd harder than the takedown had. Gasps moved in a wave from rail to canopy. A boy in the school group covered his mouth with both hands. The teacher straightened, still shielding her students, eyes wet but unbroken. The retired Marine lowered his chin and gave one sharp nod that looked like a salute, stripped down to bone and truth. Emma Pike held the nurse's sleeve in a small fist, her face pale, gaze fixed on Trey with fierce concentration. Milo tried to lift his head toward the nearest phone, toward any lens that might still turn this into content. "It's a prank," he blurted, voice scraping now. "It was just a prank. Tell them. Tell them I said it." Trey did not look at the cameras. He looked at the weapon, at Milo's hands, at the civilians behind the rope line, then back to the restraint point. "Hands flat," he said. Milo spread his fingers on the stone. "Do not move again." This time Milo obeyed at once. Colonel James Whitaker stepped into the lane with command in every inch of his posture, coat dark with rain at the shoulders, jaw set like carved granite. He took one look at Trey's control position, one look at the weapon on the ground, and one look at the crowd geometry that had been preserved despite the breach. His assessment took less than 2 seconds. "Perimeter locked," he ordered. "No one enters. No one touches evidence." The airport liaison echoed immediately into his radio. "Perimeter locked. Evidence visible. Suspect prone and controlled. From the outer road came the rising pulse of sirens, then the hard stop of vehicles at the transit gate. 30 seconds stretched, then closed. 2 airport police officers and a sergeant moved in at a disciplined jog. Not reckless, not slow, their boots splashing through runoff as they crossed from asphalt to stone. Behind them, an additional officer held the outer edge to prevent crowd drift and keep a clean corridor for extraction. "Airport police," the sergeant called. "Who has primary control?" Whitaker answered first, voice clipped and formal. "Colonel James Whitaker, 3rd Infantry Regiment. Staff Sergeant Trey Garcia has lawful control of suspect after immediate, apparent firearm threat inside civilian density. Weapon secured on stone, right side of lane. Subject altered imitation markings to mimic live firearm." The sergeant's eyes went from Whitaker to Trey to the black painted muzzle. He understood instantly what that paint meant. "Copy. Staff Sergeant, maintain hold." "We'll cuff on your count." Trey shifted his weight just enough to expose Milo's left wrist without sacrificing control of the right. "Ready? Cuffing." The first cuff closed with a metallic snap. Milo flinched and sucked air through his teeth. The second cuff followed. Trey released pressure in controlled increments, never all at once, and only when the sergeant confirmed custody twice. "Suspect restrained. You can disengage." Trey rose in one smooth motion, stepped back 2 paces, and came to a disciplined stance at the lane edge, breathing even, gloves marked now with thin streaks of black paint. The visual contrast was stark. Immaculate uniform, paint transfer from a fake weapon designed to trigger real fear. Rain ticked softly off his kepi brim. One of the teenagers who had recognized Milo earlier spoke up from behind the rail, voice shaking but clear. "He painted the orange tip. I saw him do it on a clip preview this morning. He said he needed it to look real." His friend swallowed and nodded hard. "He said military spots get bigger reactions." The sergeant pointed to an officer with a notepad. "Take their statements, names, contact, exact words." The officer moved to the rail and began recording, while another knelt by the weapon with gloved hands, photographing position before touching anything. He lifted the fake pistol carefully, rotated it for visible markings, and exposed a crescent of orange plastic beneath fresh black paint, near the muzzle seam where Trey's glove had scraped it during the disarm. Distinctive detail confirmed. He sealed it in an evidence bag marked with time and location. "Imitation firearm, altered," the officer said for the body camera record. "Orange safety indicator, deliberately obscured." Milo, now kneeling under guard, tried to pull his shoulders back into swagger. The effect failed. Rain had flattened his hair. His hoodie was smeared with grit from the stone. The live stream still ran from the chest mount, catching every second of his restraint and the evidence procedure unfolding around him with clinical precision. "Can I shut that off?" he asked, trying for casual and landing on desperate. Whitaker looked at the camera, then at the officer nearest Milo. "Device is evidence." The officer unclipped the chest rig and powered the stream down. "No further broadcast. You'll have opportunity to speak through counsel." For the first time since the breach, Milo had nothing to perform to. The retired Marine stepped forward as far as the rope allowed and addressed the sergeant, voice rough but unwavering. "I witnessed full approach. He ran at that soldier with what looked live. Guard gave him every chance to stop by presence alone. Response was clean." "Statement noted, sir," the officer replied. The nurse raised a hand without leaving Emma's side. "We were in his path. Staff Sergeant Garcia redirected him away from my patient before contact with the chair. Please include that." The officer met her eyes and wrote every word. Emma looked from the handcuffed prankster to Trey's paint-marked gloves. "He protected everybody," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, but the sentence carried. Whitaker heard it. So did half the crowd. By the middle of that minute, the lane had transformed from shock scene to documented incident. Photos were logged. Witnesses were separated in small groups for statements. The painted imitation firearm sat sealed and tagged. The chest camera and phone were both collected in individual evidence pouches. External contact had become institutional action, and action had become record. The airport police sergeant approached Whitaker and Trey together, rein stippling his uniform cap. "Based on witness accounts, visual evidence, and altered imitation firearm presentation, we're booking him for assaultive conduct, panic incitement, and interference at a military ceremonial security perimeter. We'll coordinate with federal and county prosecutors for a final charging stack." Whitaker gave a single nod. "Understood." Then he turned deliberately so the crowd could hear what came next. "Let the record be clear," he said, voice carrying across the rail and up toward the misted headstones. Staff Sergeant Garcia acted within protective force doctrine under immediate apparent lethal threat in a civilian-dense corridor. His restraint was disciplined. His judgment was correct. His action prevented injury. No one clapped. The place was too sacred for that. But a visible release moved through the witnesses like breath returning after a held dive. Shoulders dropped, hands loosened. The teacher finally lowered her protective arm from her students and wiped her cheek with the back of her sleeve. The contractor in work boots put his cap back on slowly, then removed it again, overcome by the setting and the statement and the realization of how near panic had come. Milo looked up at Whitaker with a last fragment of defiance. "You're making this bigger than it is?" Whitaker's gaze did not soften. "You brought a fake gun with real-world presentation onto sacred military ground and charged a uniformed sentinel through children and veterans. The size was set by your choice." Milo looked away first. The sergeant signaled his officers. "Transport." They brought Milo to his feet, turned him toward the gate, and walked him out under firm control. As he passed the rope line, no one taunted him. No one shouted. Silence judged him more completely than anger could have. The two teenagers who had once watched his channel stared at the pavement, embarrassed by recognition. The grandmother with the folded photo held it tighter and kept her eyes on the headstones instead. 3 minutes after custody transfer, an officer returned with a small packet and approached Trey. "Staff Sergeant, your glove has evidence transfer. We need those for chain of custody swabs." Trey removed both gloves with precise care, handed them over, and accepted a fresh pair from ceremonial staff. Physical evidence accounted for. Process intact. Whitaker stepped in close enough for only Trey to hear. "You held the line." Trey's answers stayed in that same measured cadence. "Yes, sir." Whitaker looked toward Emma and the nurse, then back to Trey. "You'll complete statement, then resume assignment." "Yes, sir." By the time Trey turned back toward the lane, the mist had thinned, and the morning light had strengthened across wet marble. The crowd remained quiet, transformed by what it had witnessed. Not pageantry, but disciplined protection under pressure. Not spectacle, but earned authority. Trey adjusted his stance, shoulders square, face unreadable again, and waited for the next command as sacred order settled back into place around him. Whitaker did not let the silence drift into confusion. He raised one hand toward the rail and spoke with parade ground clarity. "Ceremony team. Reset lane. Witnesses remain available. School group holds position until release." Then he turned to Trey. Statement table. 2 minutes. Yes, sir. Trey moved to the canopy where a folding table had been cleared beside the sealed evidence bags. The fake pistol sat tagged and barcoded. Black paint flecked where his glove had scraped the muzzle seam and exposed the orange beneath. Milo's chest rig and phone rested in separate pouches, each marked with time, collector, and location. The officer who had taken Trey's gloves logged them as transfer swabs and initialed the chain of custody line before sliding the packet into a rigid evidence case. The airport liaison, still damp at the collar, held his radio close and listened to dispatch confirm every callback he had triggered during the breach. Incident number assigned, the voice crackled. County prosecutor notified. Federal liaison copied due military perimeter. Preserve all media. He acknowledged each item, then looked at Whitaker. All external notifications completed, sir. Good, Whitaker said. Keep them completed. By 0734, the first written statements were underway. The retired Marine gave his account without embellishment, voice rough but precise, identifying the point where Milo crossed from stunt to assault. The teacher, still pale, described how Trey's redirection had kept Milo's body and the apparent muzzle away from her students. The nurse detailed the wheelchair angle, the brake click, and the inches between Emma's armrest and Milo's path. The two teenagers gave the full context they had withheld out of shock. They had recognized Milo from clips, seen his teaser post at dawn, and watched him paint over the orange tip in a parking lot clip he deleted minutes later. An officer read that line back to confirm. Both teens nodded, ashamed and steady. The loaded hesitation in their earlier whispers resolved there at the table. They had not coordinated with him. They had frozen because recognition arrived too late. Emma waited beside the nurse until her turn as a witness was requested, and then waved by the sergeant after consulting the prosecutor on speaker. Minor observed from protected position, he said into the phone. Corroborated by adult witnesses and video. The prosecutor's answer came flat and practical. No child interview needed. Preserve her from process. The nurse's shoulders dropped half an inch when she heard it. Trey gave his statement in military cadence, each sentence clean, each observation bounded by fact. Distance, angle, apparent weapon profile, civilian density, intervention sequence, disarm, verbal commands. No adjectives, no dramatics. When the officer asked what prompted immediate action, Trey answered. Apparent, lethal threat in a civilian-dense corridor with a child and mobility-limited elder in hazard path. The officer stopped writing for a beat, then underlined the line. At 0748, Whitaker stepped away for a secure call, rainwater still beaded on his coat sleeves. Trey watched him from the edge of the canopy without turning his head fully. Awareness still spread across the lane, the rail, the students, the headstones climbing into thinning mist. Whitaker returned 3 minutes later. Preliminary charging approved, he said. Assault of conduct, panic incitement, interference with military ceremonial operations using an altered imitation firearm. Magistrate wants appearance before noon. The airport liaison added. Airport police requested our route status for the Gold Star program. Whitaker looked at Trey. Can you continue mission? Trey's answer came without pause. Yes, sir. Then we continue. At 0810, after scene photographs were completed and the lane was released by police, the wreath transfer detail resumed. Ground crew dried the rails again, hands moving with the quiet urgency of people restoring order through craft. The draped stand was rolled forward. Trey took point with fresh white gloves, uniform restored to immaculate lines despite the rain and the residue of force still alive in his forearms. The crowd that remained did not chatter now. They watched with a reverence sharpened by what they had seen. When Emma's chair came alongside the rope for departure, she lifted her chin toward Trey. Protocol held his posture, but he shifted his gaze 1 degree, enough to acknowledge her presence. She whispered, "Thank you for keeping us safe." The nurse squeezed her shoulder, uncertain whether he could respond in that setting. He did, in one quiet sentence meant only for her. "Your father would be proud of your courage." Emma's eyes widened. "You knew him?" Trey held the line of duty and gave her the truth in measured form. Specialist Nolan Pike served with honor. The nurse looked at Trey then, fully understanding for the first time why his stillness had carried such weight. She had seen his focus. Now she saw its source. By 11:17, the rain had finally broken into pale sun over courthouse steps 3 miles away. Milo stood in a wrinkled holding uniform beside appointed counsel. No camera on his chest, no grin left to sell. The courtroom held veterans waiting for unrelated hearings, clerks with files stacked high, 2 reporters, and 3 members of the school faculty who had chosen to attend after giving statements. Whitaker stood in dress coat near the back rail. Trey stood 1 row behind him, motionless, a sentinel even without marble beneath his boots. The judge read the affidavit, reviewed still images of the painted muzzle, and listened to the officer summarize witness consistency across independent accounts. She asked one question that cut through legal framing to moral fact. "Did you understand this was an active military ceremonial corridor with civilians present?" Milo stared at counsel, then at the bench. "I thought it would look intense," he said. "I didn't think—" "That is clear," the judge replied. "You did not think." She set conditions with formal precision. No contact order with witnesses, immediate removal and forfeiture of monetized incident footage, mandatory community service at veterans support programs, and a required formal apology delivered in person at the afternoon Gold Star Remembrance event he had tried to exploit. "You sought audience through fear," she said. "You will now stand before those you endangered, without a lens to hide behind." Milo swallowed and nodded once. At 1540, the airport annex hall held rows of folding chairs, service flags, and a table lined with photographs of fallen service members. Gold Star families sat in the first 2 rows. Emma and her nurse were there, the retired Marine with his cane beside them. Whitaker near the aisle. Trey posted along the wall in ceremonial uniform as security and witness. Milo stepped to the podium under supervision, hands unclasping and reclasping at the edge of the wood. His voice shook on the first sentence and never fully steadied. "I treated military honor like content," he said. "I scared children and families. I disrespected a sacred duty. I was wrong." He looked toward Emma, then dropped his eyes. "I am sorry." No one applauded. No one shouted. The silence that followed carried judgment and, more importantly, boundary. His words were logged, accepted as ordered, and left to stand. By 1805, Trey was back on Arlington Stone, where the light had turned amber at the edges and cool blue in the shadows. The tomb stood ahead in solemn geometry, marble bright against deepening sky, rows of headstones stretching beyond like disciplined ranks under evening wind. The day's reports were already in motion. Evidence delivered to property control, pain analysis requests submitted, witness statements uploaded, dispatch recordings archived, courthouse order transmitted to Command Legal, and the liaison's final incident email marked complete. Nothing hung loose. Nothing waited unnamed. He took his post. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Tourists gathered in respectful quiet, among them veterans, with weathered faces, a family guiding a grandfather in a wheelchair, high school students with phones lowered at their sides. Near the viewing line stood Emma with her nurse and the retired Marine, all three still, all three watching not for spectacle, but for continuity. Trey's face remained carved from discipline, eyes fixed on the line only he could see, body moving in ritual precision that turned motion into vow. On his next pause, Emma raised a small salute with a hand that did not tremble. Trey held stillness for the full count, then gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, a sanctioned human grace within iron protocol. The retired Marine drew himself straighter on his cane and returned the salute to the child. The nurse blinked hard and smiled without sound. Trey turned. He resumed the march, boots on marble, wind over stone, flag above the hill, taut and unbowed. The sacred order was not restored by anger, not preserved by performance, but carried forward by disciplined hands, witnessed by those he protected, and sealed again in the measured cadence of a sentinel who chose duty over recognition, every step a promise that memory would be guarded through the night.